Hey everyone, this is Mike. Today we're going to be talking about balance in Final Fantasy XIV, as well as a little bit about the meta game that we currently have going on in Shadowbringers. So if you take a look at the meta right now, it is incredibly good if you were to compare it to something like Heavensward or Stormblood, the previous expansions. Because back then the meta was really stale, you basically had your 8 jobs that would be run all the time, and there was very little flexibility in between this. Now when we look at Shadowbringers, with the introduction of having a unique role grant you 1% increase to, I believe it is damage, might be stats overall, but I believe it is just damage, you get that 1%. So when it comes to the meta, the only thing that you really need to look at is to have those 5 different roles in your team. Tanks and healers you're always going to have, so that's 2 of them already accounted for. And then in general you're going to take a melee, a ranged and a caster, but then your 4th DPS is up to you, whichever you want to take or whichever the players want to play, of course. Right now, the thing when it comes to like doing damage and stuff like that, the only real thing that you have to worry about is like having a res on your team or something like that when it comes to progression. So if, for example, say somebody wants to play Black Mage really badly, they can do that, and then you can take, for example, a summoner as well next to it, or something like a Red Mage to fill that 4th DPS slot. So right now I think with this meta being a take 5 roles and then your 4th DPS can be whatever, is a really good thing. When it comes to progression, I think that some jobs can use a little bit of help, Astrologian being one of them, and of course also being a Red Mage, which we already know is going to be buffed in the future as well. But I think there could be some other changes that might be pretty decent as well. Not only for when it comes to actual balance, but also when it comes to improvements to the gameplay of certain jobs. So let's get into that, shall we? First of all, when we take, we'll just go down the list, by the way. I'll just start with the tanks and then make my way down to the casters as to what I think should change, or how things have already changed, or how well they are at the moment. So when it comes down to tanks, I would personally like them to just not touch them at all. I think the balance in between the tank role is incredibly good right now. All of the tanks do pretty reasonable DPS. They can compete, well, not necessarily compete with DPS players, of course, but their DPS is pretty substantial, and when it comes to in between the role itself, the damage is also relatively stable in between the 4 different jobs. If one were to be an outlier, it would be Warrior. Warrior's DPS is a little bit less compared to the other 3 tanks, but not that low that you wouldn't consider taking it. I took it, for example, over a Gunbreaker when it came down to progressing Alexander Ultimate, and I am still very happy that I made that choice to play Warrior over something like a Gunbreaker, because Warrior is the one that is so much stronger when it comes to its defensive toolkit, and then of course it also brings a lot of healing to the table, meaning that you're going to be stressing out your healers a lot less. So I still think Warrior is a pretty solid choice. Yes, it does less damage, but it does have a lot of other opportunities that the other tanks don't have. When we take a look at the healers, healers are in a little bit of a worse spot than the tanks, because in the healers you're pretty much going to be taking White Mage and Scholar for the most part. Astrologian did get a nice buff, especially towards the Astrologian and White Mage combination, so that the Nocturnal Astro is a lot better now. Still not amazing, but it is a lot better now at least. And when it comes down to Astro as a healer, I think they're pretty fine. Now the only issue that I have with Astro is their damage output, not necessarily their personal one or their rate DPS, but the combination of the both of them, and also its mana management. If we take a look at what the other 2 healers have, they have a lot higher damage contribution to the rate in general, and they also have much better mana management. So when it comes to Astrologian, they can use a slight buff when it comes to damage, either be it through the personal damage that they do or to the damage that they provide to the rate. Maybe make Divination, now I guess it's already 2 minutes, right? Maybe it's 3, I'm not 100% sure. But maybe change Divination a little bit, make it stronger, make it shorter cooldown or something like that. Or maybe change something with the cards. Or just make Malefic stronger, or their dot or something like that. But just give them a little bit of something. And then when it comes to the mana management, I've made this proposal a few times already in previous videos where I talked about Astrologian, and it is maybe make it so that their cards generate some mana for them as well. Because when we look at the other 2 healers, of course Lucid Dreaming is available to all of them, but then White Mage has Thin Air, which makes it so that they waste 0 mana, and then they also have their Lilies, which are also free GCDs. Scholar has Aetherflow as well as Energy Drain, so when they don't need to use Aetherflow on those healing of GCDs, which are technically free because they don't cost mana, they can use it on Energy Drain, which then generates mana for them instead. And then when we take a look at Astrologian, they have Light Speed. That's it, and it's not like Thin Air where you use 0 mana, you're still only getting a mana cost reduction. So outside of that, I do feel like they need something. I would personally like to see it be on the card play, because card play is kind of like the big identity of Astrologian, so making that stronger is going to be really good, because it makes it so that you want to play more cards because you're getting mana back from it, and then it also works kind of in its identity of being the card mage and the buffer of the party. So I think those two things need a little bit of changing, or it would be nice that they would be changed, because then it makes it so that Astrologian would be a little bit more viable for progression rating as well, which of course with patch 5.2 new raid tier comes out. Of course, once you're a few weeks into the raid tier and people have gear, doesn't really matter what jobs you bring. But when it comes down to week 1, week 2 progression, you still want to take pretty much the best that is available to you to just make that DPS check a lot easier. And I think also when it comes to progression, you're going to be rezzing people a lot, so having a rezzing caster is going to be really helpful. But of course, if you do decide to run a Black Mage, for example, then your healers will need to do the rezzing, and if an Astrologian has to res, their mana is going to shambles, so you don't really want that to have happen. So I think they could use a little bit of help in that department. Then moving on to the melee DPS, which is a role that currently is really well balanced. Ninja got its damage buff with the rework in 5.1, then of course Samurai also got its buff where their Shoha can now be used pretty often throughout the new meditation stacking with the AI jutsus and stuff like that. So I think currently the job balance in between the role itself is really good. Damage output is still pretty good as well. It is above the range, which I think it should be. A lot of people say no, the ranged DPS have always done more than melees, it should stay like this. I personally don't think it is that way, because ranged have freedom of movement, whereas melees need to keep melee uptime. Of course, keeping melee uptime is not always that big of a challenge, but when it comes to hitting those positionals in all fights and that kind of stuff, it can prove to be a little bit difficult, especially when you compare it to something like a ranged. So I do personally think that melees should be above ranged physicals, but when we talk about ranged physicals, I'm also going to talk about how I want to have them a little bit higher of personal DPS as well. But we'll talk about it in just a second. But when it comes to melees, in between the role itself, really well balanced. When it comes over to like the rest of the party, I think they're in a pretty good spot as well. The only change I would like to see happen with the melees right now is for Monk to have a little bit of a change in playstyle. Back in Stormblood, especially towards the end of it, the Tornado Kick rotation was something that was very popular and was also very high in damage. And it was something that was really cool to play with, because Tornado Kick has always been a skill that didn't really see much usage, and right now in Shadowbringers, Tornado Kick is pretty much never used outside of the end of a phase or like at the end of the fight or something like that, where you know you can get your stacks back with a Nutman, for example. So Tornado Kick, I would hopefully like to make it see a comeback, because it was a really cool skill, and I really do think you can kind of work your rotation around that again. And that is mainly also why I want the other two skills to see some changes as well. So in Shadowbringers we got Anatman and Six-Sided Star, which are two skills that don't really see that much usage. Six-Sided Star makes it so that your GCD becomes super long for one GCD, and then Anatman makes you channel, making you do no damage, and then get Greased Lightning stacks back. But right now Anatman has changed into a GCD itself, which I already don't like at all, because it already was clunky when it was an off GCD, and now as a GCD it's even more clunky. Still a DPS gain to use it in the opener, even if it's very slight, but it is so clunky that I personally prefer to just use the True North opening, not True North, the Perfect Balance opening, or opener. Just because, well, first of all, I'm not a pro monk, so I don't really care about having the top tier DPS, but also because Anatman is just very clunky and I don't really like it at all, other than use it during some downtime or something like that. But what I would like to see change is maybe that you get a combo with these three skills. Like for example, you use Six-Sided Star to get a long GCD, you Tornado Kick into Anatman to then get your stacks back. Like for example, make it so that activating Anatman gives you a stack already, or two stacks maybe. Or do something else that it generates stacks faster, I don't know. I don't know how, of course, that will also impact balance, because they would need to have some change to their DPS probably as well, to like potencies. But I do think that maybe, for example, make Six-Sided Star a timed GCD, kind of like you have with some of the other skills, like Sonic Break, what else do you have? Like Drill, Air Anchor for Machinist. So basically like a GCD that's on its own separate timer, that you can only use it once every so often, or maybe make Tornado Kick a longer cooldown or something like that. So I do think that or actually, Anatman's already 60 seconds, isn't it? So it would already kind of work. So if they would be able to make something happen with this so that Tornado Kicking kind of comes back into an actual rotation thing for Monk, I do think that would be really cool to see. Of course, if they don't change anything, then it will also still be fine, because Monk is already a pretty, like, it flows really well right now. But I do think that bringing back Tornado Kick would add that little bit of extra flavor that I feel like I am currently missing when I play Monk. So that's it for the melees. Balance is fine, but when it comes to Monk, I would like to see a small change in the gameplay of it to make it a little bit more exciting to play for me. Then moving on to the ranged physicals. This is a role that, when we look at the role itself, the balance in between the role is really good. You have your Black Mage, which is your machinist, then you have your buffer, which is the dancer, and then you have something in between, which is bar. So when it comes down to like the personal DPS to raid DPS contribution, it's really fine. Of course, if you play dancer, you would love to have something like a Black Mage or a samurai in your party to like buff even harder. But I do think that the overall raid DPS that each of the three jobs brings is pretty decent when you compare it against each other. Now, where the real problem lies is the fact that the overall contribution of the role itself is not necessarily that great. And what I mean by that is that it would technically be better to just take an extra caster. Right now, Black Mage and Summoner are incredibly strong, so it's technically, if you just look at the numbers that they're providing, it would be better to take a second caster rather than a ranged DPS. And when I said you can kind of allocate that 4th DPS slot anywhere, it's also never going to happen that you get a second ranged on your party. It's pretty much always going to be a second melee or a second caster, but never a second ranged, because the damage contribution that they bring is just not high enough. The only reason why people take ranged is because they provide that 1%. So I would hope to see a change in that the ranged have their damage upped a little bit. Of course, I still don't want them to overtake melees, because I do think melees should be higher, because they have more difficulty keeping uptime on the boss. Of course, not super difficult, but it is a little bit of more of a challenge rather than just range stand wherever and do damage. But I would like to see it changed a little bit. Give them a little bit more personal DPS, raid DPS, I don't know, but just give them something, because right now it's not a great spot to be in. Other than that, of course, within the role, as I said, the balance is pretty good, but comparing it to what the other DPS are bringing, they do need a little bit of a push forward. And then when we look at casters, we have another job that needs a little bit of a push in the back, which is Red Mage. Currently, Black Mage and Summoner are incredibly strong. I am very happy with this, by the way, because Black Mage has always been that job that was there but was never really used, because Summoner would just like be so much better, and even Red Mage to a point was pretty good as well at the start of Stormblood. Still was pretty good towards the end as well, but it wasn't necessarily, like, Black Mage just wasn't really used because it didn't bring a res. You had the two other casters that did have a res, and it would just make it so that Black Mage was almost never really considered, especially not for progression raiding. Now, because of the new meta, the fact that you can take two casters without losing anything, and also because like a lot more people have been running it now, so the community is kind of opening up to this idea as well, because a lot of people are stuck in this 2 melee, 1 ranged, 1 caster mentality, which I really think people should break, because it's totally unnecessary. You can just take a second ranged or take a second caster, especially second caster at the moment, because as I said, ranged aren't that amazing at the moment. So I do think like Black Mage could kind of come back. Instead of taking, for example, a second melee, which is a samurai, take a Black Mage as a second caster or something like that, because it's totally viable right now, which is why the current meta is so cool. So yeah, casters, Black Mage, Summoner incredibly strong. Summoner, since the recent buffs in 5.1, got really close to damage of that of a Black Mage. They're still not at the same level, which I don't think they ever should be, because Black Mage is the harder job to play, and they also don't have the utility that Summoner brings. For example, Summoner does very high DPS, almost the same as a Black Mage, but they still have a res available to them, and they also have Aether Pact, which also provides some extra raid utility as well. So I do think that currently both of these jobs are in a pretty good spot. If you want to have the maximum DPS output, you still take Black Mage, but if you want to have that little bit of a safety net of that extra resurrection from a caster, then you can still take that Summoner as well. And then we have the Black Sheep Red Mage. Red Mage's damage is inferior to both of them, not by a little bit, but by a lot. And their utility doesn't make up for it. So we do have Embolden, which is nice, but I have never really been a huge fan of how Embolden works. It only works on physical jobs, and it also decreases in potency, so it starts off really strong, but then over the time of the duration of Embolden, the effect goes down very quickly. So maybe they can kind of do something like they did with Ninja. Change it so that it might do less overall, or for example, I think it starts at 10% and then it goes down really quickly. Make it so that it's 5% for the whole duration or something like that, or maybe make it that the whole party is affected by it, or maybe do something like Monk, that when people are using GCDs under it, they can maybe generate mana for the Red Mage or something, so they can do more melee combos, which is their big burst. Although I think that would kind of mess up the opener and the overall job flow as well a little bit, but I just want them to get something, be it just potency buffs on their personal DPS, be it a change in Embolden. Personally, I'd really like to see Embolden change, because that would make it more uniform with the other skills as well, because Embolden is the only one that decreases in potency over time compared to all of the other DPS, and healers as well in that case. So small change there would be really nice. Of course, Red Mage is still going to be the proc god if they do give it some more DPS options, because they have that resurrection always available. They can just spam rest 2-3 people. They are going to be out of mana, but at least it helps a lot for when you're just trying to brute force your way through a fight. So I do think Red Mage, with the buffs that are going to be happening, we of course don't know what buffs they're going to be, but it should get a lot better. Hopefully we'll see Red Mage take a place back in the raid spot as well, whereas otherwise it would just completely be taken over by Summoner and Red Mage wouldn't even be considered. I've always been a huge fan of Red Mage. I played it a bunch back in Stormblood when it first launched, and I played Caster during Delta Escape. So I'm very happy that I'm back on the Caster role, and hopefully I'll be able to get to play some Red Mage as well during Prog if they buff its damage a little bit, because of course I do want to look what's best for the team, and if Summoner just blows Red Mage out of the water like it does right now, then Summoner is going to be the brain dead option for me to play. But I would love to have the option to either choose between the Summoner or the Red Mage. I don't mind if Red Mage does less damage than a Summoner. I think it should do less, because it does have that extra utility of the Embolden, the heal, and the spam rest. So I do think it should do a little bit less than Summoner, but not so much less that it does right now. So that's kind of my opinions on the current meta, the current balance of the jobs. Some things I would like to see change in patch 5.2. If you have some stuff that I didn't go over and you want to kind of share with us as well, feel free to leave your opinions in the comments down below. I always make sure to read through them. But yeah, that's gonna be it for me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.